during part one of our season preview show featuring Coach Don Patterson, a discussion on Kirk Ferentz's suspension, also a player-by-player look at each position on the offensive side of the football. Lots to come during a nearly 3-hour preview show. You'll get part one right now. This is week 245 of Brada's Branded Thoughts, and this is from the Hawkeye of the Storm. Let me introduce you to one of the proud supporters of From the Hawkeye of the Storm, Iowa floor covering down in Bondurant. Now, for the last year and a half, you've heard me talk about this great company in the heart of central Iowa. They've got their tough core, click together, 4.5 millimeter waterproof vinyl flooring, great for you DIYers out there. But even if you're just a contractor or you need a different type of flooring, they've got you covered, whether it be tile showers, carpet. Give Iowa Floor Covering a chance to serve you better and serve your flooring needs. Visit them online at iowafloorcovering.com. That's iowafloorcovering.com, or you can give them a call at 515-379-7000. That's 515-379-7000. Thank you to Iowa Floor Covering in Bondurant. A warm welcome to Hawkeye Nation here in late August as we count down the final days of the final week of the offseason. The Iowa Hawkeyes set to do business against the Illinois State Redbirds in 1 week from today. In fact, I'm joined by a guy who's very used to busy Saturdays and was long a part of several really successful programs, one being Iowa, one being Western Illinois. Coach Don Patterson is with us. Coach Patterson, it's always a pleasure. There is no better way to spend fall football, recapping games, but with you on this show. It is an enjoyable experience. We're entering year 4 of the post-game show. It's flown by. I can't believe we've been doing this as long as we have, but it's a pleasure to be joined by you and be able to be part of this preseason show and a part of another fun post-game season.
Well, Cory, the pleasure's all mine. And already today, at the end of one game, we've already got our first significant upset. Georgia Tech knocking off Florida State, as you know.
Week 0 is underway. It's one of the earlier college football games in the history of the sport because, of course, week 1 falls in August, and so to play week 0. Of course, Ireland, I don't know about the whole Ireland thing. I was thinking about this earlier. It seems like this is becoming the norm for some games to be played in week 0, but usually you only get 1 or 2 high major games. And I just wonder, Don, with the evolution of the game and all the things that have changed with the TV contracts, conference realignment, are you surprised that more conferences aren't taking advantage of those available windows the week prior to week 1?
Especially when you think of leagues like the MAC comes to mind for me. When I was in the MAC, we got really used to playing several games midweek, simply because it was an opportunity to be on ESPN, an opportunity to be seen coast to coast. And it wasn't that big a deal. You know, you just get into a different schedule. Typically, they would schedule you for that kind of game. You would have a bye the following weekend, you know. So you'd never be faced with a 3 or 4 day preparation. You always had maybe a 9 or 10 day preparation when you did have to play those midweek games.
We got a lot to get to. This is week 245 of the podcast for anybody new. I've been recording a preseason show since before the inception of this platform from the Hawkeye of the Storm. And Don, one thing that you and I are going to be working on, I hope that you'll work on this alongside me throughout the season. We are about 900 subscribers away from the 10,000 subscriber mark on the channel, which is amazing because I remember just a few years ago, we were just trying to get to 1,000 over on our channel with Mark Rogers, the Voice of College Football channel. So now we're nearing the 10,000 mark. So that'll be fun to hunt for 10,000 as we progress through what should be a very entertaining Iowa football season. But I do want to start out with the most recent news, and that is the news regarding Kirk Ferentz. We had this program scheduled about a week in advance, or at least I think the understanding is we were going to record this about a week prior to the season. And not many people, in fact, I don't know of anybody in the media that knew about this Kirk Ferentz news. And that tells me that people were being pretty tight-lipped about it because it sounds like it has been in the works for quite some time. Kirk Ferentz suspended, taking accountability in a press conference the other night regarding the potential level 2 violations that he and Coach John Budmeyer are accused of committing. just your reaction, not only to the news when you first heard it, Don, but also what you took away from Kirk Ferentz's press conference with the media.
Well, I was at practice on Tuesday, just 4 days ago, and didn't hear a word about it then. And I thought Kirk did the right thing. It's not easy to admit when you mess up, but it's the right thing to do. And I say mess up. I'm not even sure that Kirk messed up. We don't know all the details. It's obvious that either he or John Budmeyer contacted Cade before they were permitted to do so, but I'm not sure which one. Maybe both. I don't know. But in the big scheme of things, I will say this. Especially now with the transfer portal and NIL, there's been that expression, this is just the Wild Wild West, anything goes. And yet we have rules that simply do not allow a coach to contact a player until he's entered the portal. And frankly, that's the kind of rule that's been abused, I think, in any number of cases. And I think a point that's worth making, Cory, because you know of examples of this too, there are any number of examples of players being contacted by other schools and being enticed to transfer away from Iowa to another school. And you've heard about them as well as I have. And there's no permission given, and there's nobody that turns them in. Maybe there should be, I guess, but maybe that would stop it. But I don't know that would stop it either. But it happens all the time. And I have to admit, I wondered, when I heard about it, I wondered if it was a case of Michigan being publicly embarrassed for what they had done and being in the news here lately, if it was a case at some point in time of Michigan simply turning us in for the fact that we contacted Cade before we were supposed to be able to do so. I think it's entirely possible that Michigan did that. They're entitled to do it. I think it's disappointing because it's not as if we were trying to recruit JJ to be our quarterback. It was common knowledge that Cade was going to go somewhere. It was just a question of where. And that's entirely different than somebody trying to entice a first-team player away from his school. In the strictest sense against the word, against the rules. But the bottom line, Kirk is man enough to say, we made a mistake. It'll never happen again. And I'm gonna not be able to participate in this first game for that reason. And I apologize to our fans and to our team. It's the right thing to do. It's not easy for people to admit that they messed up. Kirk doesn't mess up very often at all. As you have heard me say before, he's one of the finest men I've ever known. And he admitted that he messed up in the big scheme of things. I think it's a very minor infraction that simply doesn't get reported, even though it happens all over the place.
I don't need to go on a soapbox for 20 minutes like I did last night recording a segment. But Don, you hit it on the head. I mean, this is happening all over the place. And you're right about teams and people, players, parents, coaches choosing not to report all these things. And I guess the only explanation I have for why other coaches wouldn't be reporting other coaches is because they're doing the same things. That would be the only explanation.
Right.
But there's no indication that this has been, I think it's pretty easy to say, regardless of what happened with this situation. And Kirk has basically admitted we did something wrong. All right. He's taken responsibility. You and I are not defending breaking of the rules. I think you and I are very clear and on the same page as it relates to playing by the playbook, although most coaches nowadays don't seem to care about the line in the sand. But the bottom line is, if Iowa's not doing this often, then why not report these schools left and right? And maybe there is more reporting than we know about. But if that's the case, then the NCAA is picking and choosing who they punish and who they investigate. That's the problem I have with this. And I can't imagine with all the hundreds, probably thousands of these things that are happening almost on a daily, especially during heavy recruiting seasons, I can't imagine that the NCAA never gets reports on these things. But we hardly ever hear this was big ESPN news when we heard about it, that Kirk Ferentz and John Budmeyer have been suspended for tampering.
Right.
I just don't understand, is the NCAA targeting Iowa, or is it really the case where this is like one of hardly any official reports that are made about a school tampering? I have a hard time believing that.
I don't know. It caused me to flash back on our gambling controversy.
Excellent example. Yeah.
Sports betting. Somehow we're the only schools in the country, those here in the state of Iowa, that are guilty of sports betting. Are you kidding? I will promise you there are players on every team that are betting on sports, and they're no different than the other students in their dorm either. Young people wager on sports. It might be something very innocent. It might not even involve their sport, but they'll wager on some other sport. And nowadays, of course, they make it so easy you can pick up your phone and place bets. It's kind of crazy how it bothers me, incidentally, that you see commercials about sports betting now. So we've been conditioned to believe, well, what's wrong with sports betting? I mean, anybody and everybody does it. I know grandmothers that are doing it now, but there are young people that are doing it. And the sad part of it all, of course, is they might end up generating some debt that they have a hard time paying off.
Grandmothers who are doing this, Don?
I don't. Maybe my grandmother might have thought about it, but not anymore since she's not with us. But it's kind of crazy that the only athletes that suffered are those at Iowa and Iowa State.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the racism scandal of 2020, and I have never went on the record and said that Kirk Ferentz, or certainly Chris Doyle, even Seth Wallace, who was not involved with racist allegations, but there were some allegations against a guy who is now just this beloved figure with Iowa. Yeah. And I don't have anything against Seth Wallace, and I believe in second chances. I believe in forgiveness. But it is hard to believe that some of the almost hazing-like things that were allegedly going on within the Iowa program were not going on across the country. And we heard about some things. I think there was a situation down at Utah. Of course, you had the situation with DJ Durkin years ago at Maryland. But in large part, there was not a domino effect after that. And it does seem odd that all these things happen with Iowa. And the only explanation I could come up with, Don, and I know the Michigan haters and Nebraska haters and the opponents aren't going to like me saying this, but the only explanation I have is because Iowa runs such a squeaky clean program, when something is awry, people aren't used to having to keep it quiet. Whereas these other schools, because of how they're operated, it's just common knowledge you don't share certain things to certain people. I mean, that's just a theory, Don, right? I could be totally off on that.
Expression, misery loves company. Michigan's in trouble. And to be honest with you, you've heard me talk about it before. It bothers me a lot that Michigan tried to gain an edge by spying on upcoming opponents. That's incredible that they did that. And yet they never suffered any penalty. The so-called penalty involves the coach that left, and they've admonished him by saying, you're not going to get to coach college football for these next 4 years. Well, I'm pretty sure Jim Harbaugh's not too worried about that penalty because he has no plans to do so.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, this is a fascinating topic, and I think timing-wise, you and I were discussing before we started recording, it's probably as favorable of timing as possible. And I know some people would argue, how can it be favorable timing just over a week out from the season? But you don't want this. You don't want word of a suspension of your head coach and your wide receivers, your first-year wide receivers coach, to hang over the program during the season or during fall camp. So I think timing-wise, Iowa's controlled the narrative. That is a positive. I don't expect any additional punishments for Iowa based on the fact that this was a self-imposed, self-announced suspension from the Iowa administration. So let's move on from that. I want to talk about camp. You've had the opportunity to be at a couple of practices. Of course, we were both at the Open Kids Day practice. A lot of the talk following that availability was the quarterback situation, the numbers, the unofficial numbers from Cade McNamara and Brendan Sullivan. I have continued to hear, as it relates to buzz, I've continued to hear throughout the month of August that this quarterback competition is really close, that Brendan Sullivan and Cade have been neck and neck, although Cade has gotten most of the snaps against the ones. Brendan has been quicker than people anticipated with his feet. He throws a very catchable tight spiral, and his accuracy has been, in some people's opinions, better than the incumbent, Cade McNamara. Now, it sounds like Cade has had a case of the yips, maybe in relation to the serious knee injuries returning from. And it sounds like, at least according to Kirk Ferentz, that he has settled down in the last week. But I think it's fair for fans, Don, to be a little bit uneasy when they not only see and hear evidence that Cade has had a case of the yips and has struggled with accuracy, but also to hear, okay, he's improved over the last few days. Well, here we are a week out from the first game. You would hope that he would have settled down prior to now. And there have been other things. Obviously, the Jacob Gill, I don't want to call it a revelation, but it sounds like he's really come in here and been a driving force for a young group of wideouts. I think Iowa feels pretty good right now where they are up front. We're going to go through all the positions, but what are your biggest takeaways from what you've seen, what you've heard in the month of August?
Well, I felt, based on the Kids Day practice, I was very confident we're going to run the ball better than we've run it in recent years. That may not happen. If it doesn't, then I guess I was wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think we're going to be able to get that done for two reasons. One is the offensive line as a whole is better, more experienced, and better prepared to play winning football. Not just with 5 players, but maybe with as many as 7 or 8. 7 for sure. I don't know if we can get to 8 or not, but we have a little bit of depth there, certainly more experience than what we've had in the past. And you couple that with the guys that are carrying the ball. I can think of a third reason, too. I feel good about as many as 4 running backs. One thing I like about them, they have a different profile. You know, number 2 is an entirely different runner than number 28. They're all a little bit different in their own way. And I think they present a different set of challenges to the defense. To take advantage of that, I feel really good about the fact that Liddell Betts has a great handle on when to substitute. He's a former running back already. He also knows the strengths and weaknesses of every player. It's not hard to imagine that a particular player's in the game simply because of the play that's called. And you're going to see some of that in the fall, I'm sure. Running backs are going to be in and out of the lineup. And the good news is I think we can feel good about all of them. That's a plus. And then another thing that comes to mind, I heard a comment by an offensive lineman sometime back in time, and he said, here in camp, our running game is going a little bit better. Our defense is having a little more difficulty defending them. And he brought up an interesting point. If you have a lot of fly motion, there's always the possibility that the ball is being handed off to that motion man. And sometimes it's not handed to him, but maybe there's a threat that you are going to hand it to him. And after not giving him the ball, then maybe the ball is run up inside into the box, as we call it. And the dilemma for the linebackers, if they have to honor a little bit of the threat of a fly sweep, then they're not quite as quick to hit the point of attack. And I'm talking about those plays in which the running back has the ball. Well, what that results in, Cory, is the double team having a chance to work just a split second longer. And so often, of course, you've got adjacent linemen that are responsible for a down lineman up to a linebacker. So if you can maintain that double team just 0.05 of a second longer, you get just a little more movement, a little bigger crease in the defense, and obviously a better chance to run. So the linebackers, our own linebackers, have experienced that as a difficulty in being able to defend our running game. Are they still capable of defending it? Yeah, more so than most teams, simply because of the players and who they are. But I do think it's going to enhance our running game a little bit. The threat of motion somehow affecting the play that's coming at the defense.
Let's since we're on the subject of players, personnel, I want to look at each of these positions individually. And this is something that I try to make a habit of in every one of our preseason shows, and I've done this for years. So if people are wanting us to talk about how are things going to be different with Tim Lester's system, I'm sure that will get mixed in here. But we've talked extensively about how you feel about Coach Lester. We've talked about the motion. You talked about the predictability of past Iowa offenses. And I think both of us have reason to believe that will change. But as it relates to personnel, Coach Lester is getting most of the same group that Brian Ferentz had, bringing in a couple of guys like Brendan Sullivan, Jacob Gill, that, and of course, some freshmen, too, that might have a chance at playing. So this is going to be a project. I want to lead with that. But let's look at each of these positions individually. We'll start with the most important position on the field, and I alluded to it earlier, the battle throughout fall camp. Have you seen anything during the glimpses of practices that you've been a part of here in person through this month of off-season training that gives you reason to believe that Cade has separated himself from Brendan? And do you think we could see both in game one? Because that's something that I've gone on the record and saying I believe we'll see both in some form.
Well, everybody's familiar with the Kids Day workout, and it was no secret. I think most people, as they were leaving the stadium, were disappointed with the way that Cade had played. And for that matter, maybe disappointed with all three quarterbacks to one degree or another. And as you know, Cory, I said at the time, I would like to think going forward that we have legitimate competition to see who gets the most playing time. And then talking about non-conference, we have 2 games out of 3 that we are going to be significant favorite probably, that being Illinois State and Troy. Iowa State, not so much, that's for sure. Might not be favored at all. I'd like to believe we'll be favored just because it's in Kenny. But the point I'm driving to, I'd like to see in those first 3 games, backups play at a lot of positions. It's going to be very warm anyway. I think it's going to be cooler next Saturday than it's going to be on midweek this week. Going to have maybe some 90s before the weekend. Weekend's going to be seasonal. It's going to be a high of 82, I think, right now next Saturday. But let's not forget, down on the turf, it's still going to be warm. It's an 11 o'clock kickoff. It's going to be warm. And that's all the more reason for some backups to have a chance to play. So with just a little bit of luck, we get a good look at the backups at all kinds of positions, not just quarterback. And for that matter, if you have a third guy that's compelling and has a really bright future, I'd like to think we have a chance to see him too. And of course, I'm referring to Marco as a quarterback. I think Marco has a bright future. I'd love to see all 3 of them get playing time in those first 3 games. And I realized to beat Iowa State, we might have to play nothing but our starters for all 60 minutes. We have to do what we have to do. But I'd like to believe we have a chance in 2 out of 3 games to get a good hard look at all kinds of backups on both sides of the ball.
And that is not something that we have seen out of Iowa, a concerted effort to play guys, play reserves
right
during consequential games. I reflect on the game against Nevada that finished at 3 a.m. a couple of years ago, and they're up 27-0, and Spencer Petras is still throwing the football around the yard.
Right.
I mean, to me, made 0 sense. And so do we have reason to believe that Tim Lester, his presence is going to affect those types of personnel decisions, like playing backups later in games? Is that because ultimately that comes down to Kirk Ferentz? If Kirk wants to stick with his starters, he's going to stick with his starters. Now, he's not going to be coaching game 1, but do you think Tim Lester will change that approach?
I think there's a good chance that it will change. I say that for 2 reasons. One, I think, is Kirk has a lot of confidence in Tim. Tim's been around for a while. He's been successful at more than just a few places. And he certainly knows a lot about the quarterback position and about offensive football in general. So I do think that Tim has a lot of confidence in his own judgment. And I think he's maybe in a different situation that Brian was. Brian, of course, my gosh, your dad's the head coach, and he's the same good father that raised you, and I'm sure in so many ways Brian understood I need to be obedient to my mom and dad because they're going to do nothing but the right things for me. They're going to affect my life in the right way all the time as I grow up, and even in the later life. I'm sure Brian had great respect for his dad's opinions, as he should, and not that Tim doesn't have great respect for Kirk's opinions, but Tim's in a better position to at least present his argument and his justification for what he'd like to do. And if he can't sell that idea, then it's not gonna happen. But I think Tim's a good salesman, and I think Tim's a man of conviction. And if he feels strongly about playing a second or third player, then I'm sure that he can present a good argument.
Those conversations are going to be had ahead of time because Kirk Ferentz can't be with the team after Friday night at 11:59 p.m.
Right.
So do you think this is going to be a show, Don? I know you're not a prediction guy, but I'm going to put you on the spot throughout this 2-part podcast preview show. Do you think that we will see someone else other than Cade McNamara take a snap at quarterback on Saturday?
Yes, I do.
Do you think we'll have more than 2 take a snap at quarterback?
I think it's entirely possible we'll see all 3.
Okay. I've been on the record and said I think they're going to go with 2 guys, not just mop-up duty. Like, I'm not talking about, they're up 42-0, and I don't think they're going to beat Illinois State 42-0, but they're up 42-0, now we see Brendan. I think both guys are going to play meaningful snaps. I think both guys deserve meaningful snaps. Based on everything I heard, I think it would be a disservice to Brendan Sullivan, based on what I've been told out of fall camp, if he didn't see meaningful snaps. I've not heard anything, Don, to indicate to me during August that Cade has won the job. In fact, even when Kirk talks about the quarterback situation, he never says, we think Cade's the better guy right now. What Kirk typically goes back to is Cade has played more meaningful football and played in bigger games and won more games with Michigan. And I know fans, including myself, don't necessarily love that line of reasoning, but I do think that's fair to bring up that, hey, as it relates to what they have seen since Brendan got there, it's been deadlocked. And you could argue it's on the coaches for not giving Brendan more snaps against the ones. Don, when you were at practice, I don't know how detailed you can get on this, but did you see equal snaps against equal competition at the quarterback position?
I wasn't watching that closely because I was visiting with pro scouts that I know and other former players that might have been in practice too. But I do think that it makes a lot of sense to do that. Here's the bottom line, Cory. Fair competition is a good thing. Competition makes you better. If Cade has the mindset that I don't have to be better than every other quarterback in this room, then that's the wrong mindset to have. You got to prove yourself all the time. Every day's an opportunity. You either improve or you get worse. And the mindset needs to be, I got to find a way to get better because there are other guys that want my playing time. And it's friendly competition. Those guys can get along and be great friends. I always used to tell our guys, the best player will play the most. If you're the backup, you'll play. You just won't play as much as the starter. And just for the record, if you're the starter and the backup comes in and plays better than you, then guess what? He's going to get more playing time, not less.
Including at quarterback.
But
that has not been Kirk's philosophy for much of his tenure here. It just hasn't. He sticks with one guy unless, look at CJ Beathard of 2016. We could go down a rabbit hole. But, the guy was playing with one leg, and he's still taking a pounding and a blowout loss down at the Outback Bowl. So,
well, I find myself, of course, when Cade was down and Deacon was our guy, it's not as if Deacon was lighting it up. So the obvious question is, why not take a look at another guy?
And Marco. And so, again, that's why I wonder, okay, what's different? The only thing that would be different, well, 2 things. They didn't have Brendan on the roster last year, so maybe Kirk's just got more confidence in Brendan than any other backup he's had in the past, or it's a combination of that with Tim Lester's influence. Let's move to a different position, and that is running back. You alluded to depth earlier. I think this might be the most intriguing offensive position because I think they're deepest at back, and they're deep at tight end too. We're going to get to that. But LaShawn Williams is, by all accounts, the starter. He has missed a lot of time in August due to a soft tissue injury. He is back. Doesn't sound like he's back to full speed, but they hope he will be here during game week. You add in a guy in Caleb Johnson, who I think started a little bit slow during camp. Sounds like he picked it up as August went forward. And Kamari Moulton's had a good offseason. In fact, that moved him ahead of Jazz Patterson, who flashed during last season. So there's 4 guys, and I was, quite frankly, Don, I was impressed with how Jazz ran at the open scrimmage at Kids Day. And I've always been impressed with how Jazz Patterson runs. The fact that Liddell Betts was able to hold on to all 4 of those guys, plus Terrell Washington, who's going to see a lot of snaps at receiver this year, I think is beyond impressive. So talk about this room. And, they are different guys. I had a conversation with Liddell about Caleb Johnson and how he runs, and Jazz Patterson. And, he lost a little bit of weight, the intrigue there. Just your thoughts on this room as a whole.
Well, I like them a lot, all 4 of them, for different reasons. LaShawn comes to mind. He's a really hard runner. He gets yards after contact. It's not necessarily pretty, if you will. It's just that he's just a good blue collar back. He understands, I'm going to get my pads down. I'm going to be underneath your pads, and I'm going to get extra yardage after contact. And you better be ready to tackle me because I'm coming at you. He's a pretty fearless runner. I like that in running backs, because they get the hard yards. And let's face it, a lot of the time it's the difference in making a first down or not making a first down. And then you go with Caleb, who's a little bit of a long strider. You've heard me refer to him. He reminds me of Eric Dickerson. And that's a good thing. He doesn't have a lot of COD, a lot of change of direction. But when he gets in space, he's got a little bit of a deceptive speed because he's got a little bit of a longer running stride. And I think you'll see defensive backs underestimate his speed and quickness. Speed more so than quickness.
And one
he's
thing,
had a lot of long runs already.
One thing Liddell brought up, Don, not to interrupt you, but Liddell did bring that up to me, is, hey, he's not going to be a guy who's a quick twitch type of runner, right, who is going to make guys miss in that regard. One thing that I do think we need to see out of Caleb Johnson this year, Don, is his willingness. And I would almost go a step further, and I don't know if it's taught this way, but is he looking for contact? Is he looking to, we all talk about his body and, oh, what a physical specimen this kid is. And he looks like a poor man's Derrick Henry or Braylon Allen. Okay, what I want to see, Don, is not just his ability to run when there's no one around, but his willingness and his desire to lower his shoulders, square those shoulders up, and use that size, okay? And lots of guys have long strides if you're tall. Use the size, because the dude's got a frame that he can get yards after contact.
Yeah. One thing he can do, taller guys, of course, it's a little tougher for them to get their pads down. But I think back to a guy that comes to mind for me is one of the best backs we ever had. That'd be Cedric Shaw. People asked me back then even, what makes Cedric such a good runner? And it was a pretty easy answer for me. As a defender, you didn't know which version of Cedric you were going to get from one snap to the next. There were times when he would drop his pads and try to run through you. And then if you squat to take him on, the very next snap, maybe, instead of trying to run through you, he'd put his foot in the ground and try to run away from you. So 2 different running backs, all within the same jersey number 5. And you didn't know which one you were going to get from one snap to the next. I think that made Cedric a better runner because he was unpredictable with how he was going to attack the defense. And certainly Caleb has a chance to be a little bit like Cedric in that regard. That'd be a good thing. And then we talked about, you've talked about him already. I like Kamari. I like Kamari because I think he's got really good vision. He really picks his way well. Some guys have good vision, some don't. He's got excellent change of direction. He's got very good acceleration. He's not very big, but he's not concerned about that. And we shouldn't be either because he's a tough runner. It was mentioned the other day. He's actually, I think his running back coach is the one that said it. He said, Kamari's a tough runner. I don't think he realizes he's not that big. He runs like he thinks he's bigger than that. But again, that makes him a more effective runner because he's certainly not afraid of contact. And then, my gosh, there's other guys that can play too. As you mentioned, Washington has ability. One of the things I like about a guy like Washington, and you've heard me talk about multiple formations with the same personnel. What if we have Washington in the game? And just for the sake of argument, what if we have another running back in the game? Like Caleb? Is it entirely out of the realm of possibility that we have some two-back offense with them both in the backfield, and yet we also, obviously, we motion or jump Washington out into a slot position because he's a proven receiver. And now you're messing with the other team. They don't know if it's going to be one-back or two-back offense. And some calls are geared for two-back offense, other calls are not. So you're really messing with the mind of the defensive coordinator a little bit when you change formations with the same personnel.
And Don, I think it's going to be interesting to see how Tim's comfortability with play calling with this offense and this personnel, because we both have confidence that he is going to make a world of difference as it relates to play calling. And even though I like Jerry DiNardo at Big Ten Network's tour stop at Iowa City, made the comment that I don't think we're going to see all that much different schematically. But isn't it also about, like, you can play, pro style football and, not be effective if you're predictable and you're not making calls at the right time. Your quarterback doesn't know when to option out of a play. Am I right in saying that? Like, just having a guy that knows when to call the right plays and helps his quarterback to be able to identify certain things pre-snap, if that's going to make a world of difference, is it not, regardless of personnel?
Yeah, in the past, there have been times when I've been asked, maybe by you, Cory, or by other people in the media, what can we do to juice up the offense? And a simple answer is, one thing we can do is, using our imagination, develop a few more plays to be used within our play calling. That makes you more difficult to defend if you have more plays. We had a lot of plays years ago with Coach Fry. And here's the truth, Cory. We might use a play in game 2 that was really the most efficient and most productive play that we had in the entire game. And we might not use it again until game 7. And people would say, maybe if I told them that, they might say, well, why didn't you use it in game 3, 4, 5, and 6? The simple response is it didn't have the same value in game 3, 4, 5, and 6. Game 7's defense is a lot like game 2's defense. And so we pull it out, we shine it up, and we put it on the field again, even though we haven't run the play in 5 weeks. We used to do stuff like that. Now, you obviously have to have a lot of plays to be able to pick and choose from one game to the next what's on your play calling sheet. And it does make you more difficult to defend, because the plays that might bother the other team the most are plays they haven't even seen you run the last month. It requires more work for the coaches, but I'm confident that Tim has a lot of plays that are available to him to run.
Here's a guarantee for it. Tim will have more plays up his sleeve than Brian Ferentz ever did. And I'm not trying to knock Brian. I'm just more speaking about Tim. He will have more plays. And hey, I've no doubt it's taking and going to take time for a lot of these players to get comfortable running these different plays. But this is coaching. This is a process. And Don, I want to transition to the passing game, specifically wide receiver, because we've talked about quarterback, but I've made the comment in the last couple of weeks that I'm not pulling the brakes back from my preseason predictions about the offense improving substantially, but I do think it might take until October to notice a real big difference. And I could see this offense, the pass offense specifically, starting to click in October. One reason, because I think once that run game gets comfortable and develops rhythm, I think the run game has a chance to be pretty good right off the bat. But I think that will start to open up windows for these receivers for play action. And I think, barring breakdown with pass protection, the quarterbacks can sink into a rhythm, especially if there's a rhythm as it relates to, okay, how many snaps is Cade getting versus Brendan, or has one of the guys emerged over the course of the first 4 weeks as the cemented starter? So let's talk about receiver, and then I want to get your opinion on that prediction. It's obviously a very young room, but there are a couple of guys who have been around Big Ten football for quite some time, one being Caleb Brown, who's going to miss game one due to the offseason OWI. But I want to start with Jacob Gill because you and I had a conversation prior to recording as well. I've stated, and I'll say it on the record again, I think Jacob Gill is the best receiver right now on this roster. You've been able to observe Jacob Gill in practice more than the average fan has. What are your thoughts on him leading a very young group?
I've been very impressed with Jacob for what I've seen. And I've heard from people within the program that they're also seeing a lot of value in having Jacob on our team. One of the nice things he's done, he's got a very serious work ethic. He understands attention to detail. I've heard from a good source, he's been a really good role model for all those younger receivers because he understands that you've got to learn the finer points of the game to be able to achieve to your highest level. So I think that's a good sign. I also like the fact that he's not afraid to get his nose dirty, that he understands that blocking is part of the job. Some guys like to think their scholarship just entails running and catching passes. That's only part of the job. Tim DeWhite was such a valuable player to us because he was also a really, really effective crack blocker. If he was lined up and cracking on an inverted safety, that's one reason we had a play called crack and go, because that safety, he was trying to be sure to not get heavy contact from Tim. And of course, if he's trying to avoid Tim, that's why we're running crack and go. And Tim DeWhite's free downfield for a long touchdown pass just because that safety didn't want to be hit hard one more time by Tim DeWhite. So I like Gill. I think he understands football well. I think he does have some athleticism that can show up. I'd like to think someday maybe here's another guy that was underappreciated, I think, when he was here. Charlie Jones comes to mind. Charlie might not be the fastest guy in the world, but he certainly knew how to play. He was fast enough and quick enough and had good enough hands and was fearless too. And I see those kind of traits also in Gill. Maybe he's not quite as fast as Charlie, but he's still got adequate speed. And he certainly understands how to run routes. And he's got good toughness. So I like him. I think he's going to be a really good addition to our program. And I think he's going to set a great example for those younger receivers that are in that same room.
Caden Weegan likely going to play a lot as well. And I'll go on the record and predict. I mean, I've already kind of gone on the record with quarterback. I think you're going to see both guys week one. Talked about running back. I think LaShawn. And then after that, it's basically you're going to be sharing. Three guys are going to be sharing the majority. I think you could see any combination of, as it relates to number of snaps per game. As it relates to receiver, I think Gill is the obvious number one right now. And then when Caleb Brown is back, I would expect him to work into the top three. The problem with everybody after that, with the exception being Caden Weegan, but the other guys, the other scholarship receivers, a lot of injuries this fall. Like that's the one position that unfortunately has been hit by the injury bug. Seth Anderson seems to miss every spring and every camp. You've got Jarrett Bowie, who's been dealing with an injury. Dayton Howard has flashed at times during the offseason, but he's been out. So I think you're probably going to see Caden Weegan as the number three guy. And for week one without Caleb, if Seth Anderson is healthy, probably Seth is your number three. But there's an opportunity, Don, for week one. And I talked about this back when Caleb Brown initially got arrested and we assumed he was going to be suspended for a game. Opportunity is knocking in week one to make a statement, a young receiver to make a statement, whether that is a healthy Dayton Howard or a Jarrett Bowie, or maybe it's Reese Vanderzee, who had a really good closed scrimmage this past Saturday. Now, he's a young kid from Northwest Iowa. Not many people had on their radar. He flashed. Maybe it's a guy like Alex Mota, who we haven't heard a lot about. Maybe it's KJ Parker. Would you agree with that assessment that probably Caden Weegan, Seth Anderson, and Jacob Gill week one, if all three of those guys are healthy?
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to see a lot of guys at receiver. If you're playing a lot of three receiver formations, then obviously it's not that difficult to get snaps for as many as 6, 7 receivers. Divide them up. Again, it's going to be a warm day. Let's keep fresh people on the field. We're not sure who's better than who anyway. Let's find out during the game. No better time to find out. Here's one thing I was pleased to hear out of Weechin. I do know he mentioned that he'd been watching some old video of Tim Dwight. And maybe he was thinking, I know he's watching him as a kick returner, punt returner also. But Weechin does have a profile a little bit like, you could call him right now a poor man's version of Tim Dwight, I guess. He does have speed and quickness, no doubt about it. Not as fast as Tim, but hardly anyone was. But he does have better speed than most players, certainly most players on our team. And he has demonstrated some toughness. I like the way Caden's returned punts and kicks. I think he's going to bust some returns this year too. So great opportunity for all kinds of players. We haven't talked about our guy from Regina, who does have good hands. I've seen him play a lot of games. Wick has got potential too. I don't know where he is in the mix right now, but the point is it's a great opportunity for someone. And if I was one of those receivers, I'd be determined to find a way to gain an edge over all these other receivers. And I wouldn't be playing as a young receiver. I'd be paying a lot of attention to what Gil's saying and what Gil's doing. I try to emulate him because he's got the right work ethic, and it's the kind of work ethic I would hope that all of our receivers would have.
I'm going to be intrigued to see what the week one, not to transition to special teams, but the week one depth chart set to be released Monday says at special teams, because I shared this with my premium members on YouTube here about a week ago, but Trip Woody reportedly sustained an injury on the last day of fall camp. So the backup kicker right now, until we hear of Iowa grabbing a preferred walk-on transfer, which they still could, they can do that this month, it's going to be Alec Wick. Based on everything I've heard, he's the only guy that's been working. I don't know how much work he's gotten, because again, that was last day of fall camp that Trip Woody went down. But let's hope Drew Stevens stays healthy, because you may see Alec Wick, but it's not going to be at receiver, Don.
Well, speaking of our place kicker, I was pleased with him. Drew was 7 for 8 on Kids Day, the longest of 52. A lot of them in the high 40s, as I recall. One that was barely wide. So I think he's going to have a great year. I was impressed with our young punter. The very first punt, I couldn't help but notice he was punting to a long field. He had a little bit of wind in his face. It was just a slight breeze out of the north. And I measured it off. It was 58 yards with good hang time. So he can spin it like it reminded me a little bit of Reggie Roby with the way he hit that ball. And he'd also demonstrated in the pre-practice, he understands pooch punting. He did a good job of killing a lot of punts inside the 10. So he looks a lot like our old number 9. Incidentally, a good friend of mine is a Bear Scout, and they are very, very happy with Tory Taylor. They think they made a good choice in having Tory as their punter.
I tell you, Don, if they can get anything close to what Tory gave him in the punting game, and they keep Drew Stevens healthy. And by the way, I think they're deeper at punter. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but they've had years where they didn't have anybody after their starting punter. Ty Nissen has had a good offseason, it sounds like. Now, it's Reese Dakin's job. But, I mean, if they can get anything close to Tory's production with Reese, and Drew Stevens is solid, which I expect him to have a good year. He's had a terrific camp. I think they're going to be, I mean, they got a chance at being every bit as good on special teams as they were last year. Caleb Brown's another year older, too. I mean, I got special teams, the banner up here. We might as well hit special teams because you mentioned kicking and punting. I guess we'll start with Drew Stevens. He has, like I said, had a great camp. And although Trip Woody is out right now with an injury, I feel pretty good about the kicking game, even though they struggled a little bit with kick protection last year. Drew's changed a couple of things. He talked to me on media day about how he's changed some things mentally with how he approaches each kick and his percentages. And of course, he's got a huge leg. They've been pretty good this fall.
Yeah, I agree. Right now, I wouldn't trade any other kicker in the Big Ten for Drew Stevens.
That's a big statement to make, Don. There's a lot of good kickers in this league. And then you add in the 4 teams in the West Coast. Punt return, kick return. Caleb Johnson sounds like he's going to be the kick return guy. You talked about the long stride, but that's also a skill and a knack that's different than punt returning. And it sounds like Caden Weejan's going to be the primary punt return guy. You talked about the speed of Tim Dwight. What do you like about those two guys in the kick return game?
Well, I just think back to the game against Michigan. Michigan had, I believe, 2 kicking downs that were potentially really good returns. One of them had a penalty and we brought it back. And the other one was maybe a 25-yard gain or so, as I recall. So he has shown he's fearless back there. He's got good speed and quickness. Those guys on kick units, they understand maybe my only appearance on Saturday is going to be on those kicking downs. I'm going to make them all count. So when they go on the field, they go on the field with a purpose. We'll see if we have that same good result like we always have in the past.
Let's transition over to the tight end group. Luke Lachey's coming off fairly serious injury that did put him out for the season, although wouldn't equate it with what even Eric All dealt with, although that was a back injury, different circumstances, but certainly not what Cade is coming off of. So I've no reason to think Luke is not fully healthy. And then Addison Estringa got a lot of time when Eric All and Lachey went down a year ago. So he's a year older with more experience. Hayden Large is working more with the tight ends now because they're going to be loaned less fullback. And I think when they go fullback, we may see Eli Miller. We talked about Hayden Large and his size at 6'5", maybe struggling to get low enough to be a fullback. I think Eli Miller is probably going to be the fullback when they use one primarily. So you're going to get Hayden Large in more tight end situations. And how about a little bit of a steal, a little bit of a gem? Here's a walk-on in Johnny Pascuzzi who enters the portal during the offseason and then retracts his name and comes back to Iowa. They are 4 guys deep, and that's not counting Zach Ortworth, who played last year due to injury. So sometimes this is where you see when you sustain a lot of injury at a given position, like they did last year, and young guys are forced into playing time, this is where you reap the rewards, is later on you've sped up the growth of some young players. They're almost as deep at tight end, in my opinion, as they are at running back, Don. I think the pecking order has to be preseason as far as the top 3, Lachey, Estringa, and Pascuzzi. But maybe it's Ortworth, maybe it's Large. That's got to be a luxury to have that kind of depth.
I do think that tight end is a good spot for us, and I think it all starts with a great example being set by Luke. I think Luke's in a great place right now. I think he's healthy and excited about what he might be able to accomplish this year, what we might be able to accomplish as a team. And I think all those other tight ends, the thing I appreciate, all those guys understand. A lot of people refer to us as tight end U, and that's something that they take great pride in. And as an old tight end coach, I take great pride in that too. We really are the school known for tight end play, and that goes all the way back to guys like Marv Cook and Jonathan Hayes and Mike Flagg. So we've had great tight ends for a long time, and certainly we have every right to be proud of the productivity that those guys have been able to give Iowa football. I'm excited. As a group, I like them. I think they all understand how to run routes. They all have soft hands, it seems. I don't see many drops out of the tight ends. And, of course, they understand that that's just part of the job description. Let's face it, if we're going to hang our hats on our running game and we need to be able to do that, then we have to have consistent productivity out of the tight ends. It doesn't matter if there's one or more than one. I like the idea of having more than one. I'd like to think that maybe one of those tight ends could complicate things for the defense again, but maybe also assuming a role of a lead blocker, a lot like a fullback. Maybe he lines up as a fullback, maybe he lines up as a second tight end, and motions back into the backfield. Again, we're messing with the other team if we're giving them some two-back looks with a couple of tight ends and only one back in the backfield. Maybe one of those tight ends can effectively be a tight end / fullback. Maybe more than one can do that. That'll make us more difficult to defend.
And then offensive line, you mentioned the depth there. I mean, we have not yet seen the proven depth, I guess, that we keep hearing about. We've seen a lot of guys play, but it hasn't necessarily been high-level performance and not what this team needs to have an effective run game, maybe to the level of like a 2020. So, I think the top 5 are pretty well cemented. I think Nick DeYoung, Tyler Ellsbury, Kirk has basically said those guys are going to work off the bench and give them valuable snaps. So there's your 6 and your 7. Bo Stevens, Mason Richmond, Connor Colby, Jennings Dunker, and then, of course, the guy in the middle, Logan Jones. You mentioned it. Can you find number 8? Maybe it's a Cade Piper who really came along last year. Maybe it's a young Trevor Lauck or a young Jack Doetzler. How confident are you with this group? It's just hard for the average fan, including myself, to find a lot of confidence until I see it on a Saturday. But they did look better during the open scrimmage at Kids Day than we've seen in similar formats in the past.
Yes, they did. I thought that was a very encouraging sign. I don't know, of course, how it's all going to play out. But here's my point, Cory. Do I know that we're going to have anybody that's first team All Big Ten? I think it's entirely possible. We can have a really effective offensive line and have no one be first team All Big Ten. After all, there's 18 teams in the league. It's not easy to be first team.
I'd rather that, Don. I'd rather that. Tyler Blinderbaum was first team All Big Ten in 2021, and that line was not good. I'd rather balance across the board.
And Tristan's a great example, too. Yeah, so what's Tristan Wirfs going to do for you? Well, he's going to block his guy every time. The bad news is he's only 1 out of 5 linemen. So what are the other 4 doing? So you need to be good at all spots, but you don't have to be great at any of them. That would help, of course, if you were great at 1 or 2 spots. But the bottom line, if we have 5 guys that are playing, all of them a lot like a third-team All-Big Ten player, that's still a high level of productivity. And I think there's a possibility we'll have something like that. Maybe we can have a lot of guys, none of which are great, but all of which are good. That's something to aspire to get done, and that's certainly something that George is trying to get done, as well as the players trying to do so.
Coach Don Patterson and myself, Cory Brada, here from the Hawkeye of the Storm. You've been watching part 1 of our exclusive preseason, our annual season preview show. And, of course, during the next segment, we'll preview the defensive positions, and we'll take a game-by-game look at the schedule. I'll give my predictions, and we'll try to squeeze some predictions out of Coach Patterson. Part 2 set to be released tomorrow right here from the Hawkeye of the Storm.